Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's very nice to be here and talk to you about one of my true passions. As you might have understood from the introduction, I sort of have two areas of passion that I work in. One is on economic reforms in China, and that's been a big part of my life for as long as I've been in the academic world. But over the last decade or so, I've developed a real interest in both thinking about leadership and also teaching it at a number of different levels. And so I'm very pleased today to actually get to talk to you a little bit about some of my thoughts on these issues. I think the presentation I put together is probably a little bit longer than I was supposed to do, so I'll try to race through it so that we can have some time for questions and interactions before the end. As was also mentioned, I have done a lot of work in the executive education space in the area of creative leadership specifically. And so what I've tried to do is tailor this to really be thinking both about creativity and innovation within organizations, but also about effectiveness as leaders. And as you'll see as we go through this, I have a very firm belief that leadership is not the province of people at the top of organizations. So if you leave here today with one thing that you want to remember, or that you know, what was that talk about, and what did that dean want me to understand? It's that leadership happens because you decide it's going to happen. It doesn't happen because somebody bestows you with a position that suddenly makes you into a leader. There are lots of people in high positions of power that are very bad leaders, and there are lots of people in very low positions of power and authority who are great leaders. And so what I would like you to take away from this is that leadership is about a mindset and about an approach to how to think about organizations and your role within the organization. And you can walk out of this room today and start being a leader. And maybe you already are. But that's really, to me, the most important thing about this. And it's sort of my evangelical approach to leadership is to spread the word, spread the gospel, if you will, that leadership for you as an individual, is about a decision that you make in terms of how you approach your job. It's about how you pick up the phone and interact with a client or a constituent. It's about how you decide to interact with people that you're managing laterally towards. It's about how you coach people. And that's really where the heart of leadership is. And so I think that there's been a very damaging approach to leadership that focuses so much on people at the top of organizations and takes it out of the hands of you. And so that's really one of the most important things. And so hopefully we'll see how this kind of works together with the core concepts that I've been developing over the years. So one of my favorite, just to get us started, I'm going to actually divide this into two parts. One is what I like to think of as the myths of leadership, and the second is a framework for really thinking about leadership. But just to get us warmed up, I love starting here. Some see things the way they are and ask why, but I dream things that never were and ask why not. Who said that? It was made famous by Kennedy. He was actually quoting it from Shaw, but it was made famous by Kennedy. And it's, to me, really one of the magical moments of leadership. And he was certainly one of those individuals who just had that innate charisma. And we often think of that charisma as being something that's fundamentally associated with leadership. But I think there is an interesting question about effective leadership, especially given how much we think about it's being tied to charisma and personality. And that's certainly the way a lot of the literature has built it up over the last 30 to 40 years in academia. It's certainly the way the entire cottage industry of tests like the Myers-Briggs test build out a concept. As we think about people's personalities, and then you kind of get an idea of like, oh yeah, I'm a natural leader, I'm charismatic, or I have this set of personality traits. And I'm going to talk very much against that way of thinking about things. And what I want to do is help us build out a way of thinking about this that's applicable for you. So the first myth that I like to begin with is that it's all about the individual. You'll find an incredible number of articles and work by consultants and advisors and coaches and even people that attribute the success of a company like Google to the fact that, wow, they just really hire smart people and pay them well, and that's how you create very effective leadership and creativity and innovation within an organization. Now, the second thing that I want you to walk out of this room thinking today is it is not about the individual. You might be somebody who has gone through your life thinking, well, I'm not such a great public speaker. I never felt so much like a leader. I can't really learn these traits about leadership. But that's baloney. That is absolutely not true, because leadership is about creating an effective organizational space in which people can thrive within their work environments. And that is actually something that is easily learnable, and it's something that also is much more tied to the structure of the organization than it is to you and your personality traits. So that's the first myth. Myth number 2, it's primarily about whether or not people follow you. You will often hear this about leadership. We have this notion that if you're somebody who has been a leader since you were a child, you've always noticed that people kind of circle around certain individuals and they're followed. Now, of course, it's important to actually have the type of qualities that make people inspired by you, but it has very little to do with followership, because as you remember from what I said in the very beginning, I actually think leadership has very little to do with whether or not you have authority or direct reports, and has much more to do with how you approach the work that you do. And so I'd like to get us out of that mindset, because, again, there are lots of people who lead very well from the bottom of organizations and have very few people following them, but are very effective in everything that they do. A decade ago, I was living in New York City, and I was fascinated by the fact that one of the big things that came out around Rudolph Giuliani at the time of a crisis of this nation was that leadership is really about calm in crisis. Leadership is about the moment in which your organization or the place where you have authority suffers a crisis, and you actually are able to remain calm and lead through that. And of course, it was a very calming thing to have this individual be able to approach that crisis in that way. Right? But that is very little of what leadership is actually about. And it has to do with, if we just hope that we're selecting leaders based on whether or not they're prepared for a crisis, it seems like a very odd way of actually selecting individuals, because ultimately we hope our organizations don't have crises. Right? And so what we want is somebody who's effective 99% of the time, but we end up selecting for that 1% of the time. An additional myth here that is, I actually don't think that this is a complete myth, it's only a myth in the extent to which it's so much the focus of leadership. People think about leadership as being solely about inspiration. Right? To what extent do you inspire people? To what extent do people really want to step up and achieve for you, or because you have asked them to do something? And of course, that's an important aspect of leadership as well, but again, something that's like charisma, a very small piece of the puzzle. Here's an interesting one that I actually often love bringing into the mix, because if I was doing this in a more interactive setting and we were doing it 10 years ago, I would have said, who are the great leaders that you think of in American business today? And inevitably, I can guarantee you, one of you would have raised your hands and said Jack Welch, of course. Why? Well, I mean, you can't argue with a 1,000% increase in shareholder value. How can you make the case that he's not one of the great leaders of our time? One of the things that's quite interesting, though, because of the way in which actually Jack Welch and a couple of his compatriots and colleagues in the early 1980s built the distortion of the stock market through the smoothing of income earnings. I can tell you something that's very interesting about Jack Welch. It is true that because of that system and that intersection of the emergence of analysts and the power of analysts and the practice of earnings smoothing, Jack Welch did increase GE stock by 1,000%. But if you run the numbers based on return to assets, he's the worst CEO in GE's history. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means he's actually answering to Wall Street and he's making a lot of people a lot of money, but it's fake money. Right? So I don't know how we line that up in terms of how we assess leadership, but it certainly can't be about shareholder value. But too often it is the case that we think leadership is solely tied to the issue of the outcomes of your organization. Here's a couple of other things that we might build into this conversation about leadership, and these are less myths and more just people that I admire, but I just want to kind of add them all up there before we actually get into a more clear framework. One of the most famous people who name will also come up in recent years is Nelson Mandela. And Mandela was a great leader in a number of different ways that he thought about these issues, but he actually raised something that I certainly wouldn't put in the myth category, but something that I put in the intellectually stimulating category, something that was a really interesting approach to thinking about this, which is, of course, you need courage and you need all of these things that are good qualities that inspire people, but one of the most important things is to be able to strategically think about who your allies and who your enemies are within an organization and put your emotions aside and actually engage those people effectively. If you know anything about Nelson Mandela's career after getting out of prison, that was one of the things that made him such an effective leader, was the fact that he was willing to actually set his emotions aside and say, forget about what these people did to me. What we need to do is run a nation right now. So there's something that's very powerful to me in that piece of thinking about leadership. Dr. Kalam, of course, the former president of India, is also somebody who's very interesting to me, and he's had a lot of interesting ideas about these kinds of issues. And I think he's certainly somebody who's spoken broadly on this issue. The other person that to me is always fascinating in today's economy, sort of the 2010 version of Jack Welch, of course, would be who? If I asked you who was a great leader of today in American industry, what would you say? Steve Jobs, of course, right? And he was recently named by Fortune magazine as the greatest CEO of the decade. And he's certainly one of these people who, because of shareholder value, much like Jack Welch, has been labeled that way. And wow, what an amazing pitchman, right? Most people don't know, though, or don't even remember, even if they ever knew, that if Steve Jobs would have been allowed to continue leading Apple in 1984, we would not be talking about Apple Computer today. He would have driven that company out of business because he was such a terrible leader. Right? Now, that's blasphemous to say in today's economy, right? But it's a very interesting thing to note. He almost destroyed his own company, and he was driven out by the board of directors. Right? And so that's actually now it's interesting, there's an interesting post story. A lot of people have written about how, well, he must have changed because he's such an effective leader now. And I would argue that no, actually, it probably hasn't changed. If you read this book, Inside Steve's Brain, he's probably the same micromanaging, narcissistic, crazy person that he was back then. But the organization actually evolved a significant amount so that it could actually handle the weight of his personality in some ways. So he's a brilliant man, no doubt about it. Brilliant innovator, brilliant marketing and salesman. Is he a good leader? I don't know. It's kind of an interesting question in terms of how we think about leadership. And my last myth, which I mentioned from the beginning, is the myth of leadership being the province of people that are at the top of organizational hierarchies or pyramids. And again, this for me is so important that everybody within organizations understand that leadership is about a decision that you make today in terms of how you interact with people in your organization, how you interact with people who you're mentoring and coaching, how you interact with your constituents, how you interact with your organization. And it has nothing to do with that promotion that you've been waiting for. And frankly, if you believe that leadership is about when you get into a structural position to lead, you're not going to be a good leader. Right? It is the people who actually think actively about leadership every day, regardless of the position they're in, that, in my opinion, make the best leaders. Okay? Now, so that's sort of the broad brushstrokes, both the myths and the inspirations for me. But let's bring a little specificity to this conversation. I'm going to try to give you a framework, and it's a framework that I've developed in teaching in executive education courses about leadership for many years, and so I've tested it on a number of different audiences, but it's always interesting to test it on a new audience, so please don't be afraid to either interject or jump in or just take notes, and we'll talk about these issues at the end. The first thing that I would just like to say as the backdrop for this framework, so I've kind of put a couple of different myths out there, and I've made the case that it's not about individual charisma, it's not about your personality, it's not about the question of whether or not you're being followed within the organization. All of those things might have some implications and be important for the entire package of what leadership is, but those things in and of themselves don't comprise good leadership and don't make good leadership. But what is it about? Well, here I want to start with a framework that I like to use. And I like to think of this framework as kind of an inverse pyramid or inverse set of concentric circles that work from the broadest to the narrowest aspects of what you're dealing with when you think of leadership. Okay? So the broadest lies in the space of vision. And this is actually something that is often captured within leadership discussions. People always think, well, a leader is somebody who has vision. A leader is somebody who actually knows where the organization needs to go. And it's certainly important to think of that broadest context of the environment that your organization is embedded in and to be able to imagine a future. It's absolutely crucial to be able to think about the complexity of the environment that we live in today the complexity that your organization is, and be able to analyze it and see a distant future and be able to build the processes to get there. So there's no doubt that that's an important part. The problem is that leadership often resides there and in one other place. But there are other things that are intermediary steps. So if we go from that broadest position to a secondary position, let's think about your organizational environment. Now this is unfortunately the place where the ball always gets dropped on leadership. So often you will hear people say, well, vision and strategy is the province of leaders and managers execute. What does that mean? Managers execute. First of all, it's so demeaning. It means if you're a manager, you can't really think for yourself. You're just the person who carries out what I tell you to do, because I'm the brilliant visionary and I'll be the one who decides the direction our organization is going. Let's just think about what that means for a second, because if leadership really is about vision and strategy, and these other people carry out these things, how often is it the case that a leader has a brilliant vision or a brilliant strategy, but they have no understanding of the structure of their organization? Let's take an example. Hank Greenberg was the chairman and CEO for many years at AIG. I actually did some executive work with that organization when I was coming into, when it was in the process of falling apart, and they called up an executive education operation which I was running. And they said, can you come in and help us think about what's going on in our organization? They actually knew it was much worse than I understood at the time, but this was like 2007, and so people knew that the wheels were going to be falling off soon. And so I came in, and the first thing I said is, look, if I'm going to do an executive education program for you, I need to actually talk to people. I need to figure out what the culture is. I need to understand the structures. You just got to give me a list and entree to about 50 of your top level people. And you don't need to do that because we just did a DVD on what the organizational culture is. Martin Sullivan just got up and he told us what our culture is. Right? All you have to do is watch this DVD, right? So I was like, oh my God, this organization is in trouble. But it was a very interesting, telling problem that preceded Martin Sullivan. It actually went to Hank Greenberg, because you have these people who have these grand strategies, but they have no clue what's going on in their organization. And furthermore, they think that the action in figuring out organizational culture and structure and design is just saying it's so. Right? So here is where the rubber really meets the road in leadership. I believe leadership has to be about organizational analysis and design. I believe it has to be really rest in the position where people think deeply about their organizations and are constantly breaking them down and analyzing them. And that is not purely the province of managers. That is the province of every person who wants to think of themselves as a leader. Do you understand your organization? Do you understand its strategy? Have you taken pen to paper and written it all down and thought about the ways in which different parts of your organization influence the different outcomes that you're experiencing? That is true leadership, in my opinion, and it is sort of the lost art of leadership. It actually is a lost art that traces back to 1979, when an article was written in Harvard Business Review called Managers and Leaders, How Are They Different? And I think it was one of the most injurious articles to the field of leadership, because basically it made this case that there are people who have leadership qualities and they are over here and they do these tasks, and there are people who execute and they are over here and they do these tasks. And that is just completely bogus. It's just a bad way of thinking about organizational structure and design. Now, let's think about vision for a second. I mentioned this, and so I'm just going to run through some of these key aspects. Vision, I think, is an unbelievably important thing, and I would challenge each and every one of you. This is not the province of people who are at the top of the organization. It may be their job to set that vision a little more effectively, but you should sit down and ask yourself, do you know the vision and strategy of your organization? And not just the empty words that are written on a piece of paper and put out in some propaganda by your organization. Do you know what your organization is doing to create a competitive advantage in the marketplace, to get from point A to point B? Now, the reason I challenge you to do it is I have sat with too many executive teams, senior people in organizations, say, we'll start our leadership discussion. I want you to take out a sheet of paper. We should all agree you all know the strategy of your organization, right? Yeah, we all know. Okay, I want you to write it down. Take 5 minutes. And you know what happens? You either get 30 different statements on what the strategy is, or if you get unified statements, there are all these ridiculous things like, we're going to be the best bank in the world. Sorry guys, that's not a vision and it's not a strategy, right? And so think about it. Think about what you know and think about and if you don't know this stuff, ask. Figure it out. Do the due diligence within your research, within your organization. Talk to the person you report to. Talk to the senior person in the organization, but figure it out and find out if you know. And make it your business to know if you don't. This one I already mentioned, it's incredibly important. The alignment piece is so crucial to me in terms of how to think about organizational effectiveness. It is the lost art of leadership, but it is also the thing that every person within an organization should do. Now, I have a little model that was developed by Mike Tushman and David Nadler some years ago. It's a pretty standard thing for business schools, but I just like to think of it as a way to break organizations down. You should always be asking yourself, do you know the strategy and governance structure of your organization and what its implications are? But then the key thing is, do you know the formal structures that are helping to produce the culture in your organization? Because make no mistake about it, organizational culture does not come from words. All right, you so often have it, this is the case, that Martin Sullivan at AIG will stand up and make a DVD and pronounce the culture. Or any number of organizations, that's the case. Our culture is this. We are this kind of organization. That has nothing to do with culture. Where is culture? Culture is embedded in people and in structures. Culture is embedded in this interaction between the formal structures that exist in the organization, the people that live in those structures, and the tasks they carry out. And those things come together to produce culture. So I always like to think of this very, very kind of interesting, but somewhat simple, right? This is not rocket science. You can do this. You can break this down and figure out how. And so, so often I have, it's the case when I'm doing a session on organizational culture, and I say, how many people live in an organization that's got a toxic culture? About half the people will raise their hand. I'm not going to ask that question. but about half the people will raise their hands, and I'll say, why is it a toxic culture? And we kind of go around and around and talk about, well, the jobs are this, or people are mean. But usually if you sit down and you say, okay, our culture is X, what is producing it? Right? Are the incentive systems right? Is there a mismatch between the incentive systems and how people are controlled by the structures of their organization? What is actually producing these things? Because the nice thing about this, and this is why I do believe that this is the province of leadership, is these things are changeable. And they're not just changeable by giving good speeches about how we should all be happy. They're usually changeable by addressing the issues of the structures of the organization. So I love this. This is my favorite example of this. Tale of two banks. One of them went out of business at the current in the economic crisis, and one of them made money. Now, this one that made money has become a little bit of a has a negative reputation associated with how it made money, but there are actually very interesting things to think about in terms of the different structures of these organizations and the cultures that those structures produced that I think most people are not attuned to. There's a wonderful book on this that was written by a business school professor at, I guess she's at Wharton, called Bullish on Uncertainty. And it is just a brilliant analysis of this very basic phenomenon. So if you ask someone at Bear Stearns what the culture is like, they'll tell you, before it went down, and they'll tell you it was a risk-taking place, it was individualistic, competitive, mavericks, innovative. It was about creating expertise and allowing people to run with that expertise. Right? Almost anybody who works for Bear will tell you that. Right? At Goldman, they'll say these things that sound like, is that really true? Is it really one firm, collectivist, the firm over the individual, group-oriented? But actually, it is. If you talk to people in Goldman, it is one of these organizations where you're like, wow, those people are a part of a cult. They are drinking some kind of Kool-Aid there, and it's a little nuts, right? But the interesting thing is that approach extended to risk mitigation. And there's a very specific way that they created that's not about talking about it, but about building it into the structure of the organization. So Goldman has this practice in which people, when they're young, are constantly put on jobs that they will either fail at or are very close to failing at. Right? You're constantly put in positions, and you're not allowed to become an expert. You're constantly moved around the organization. You have no idea what you'll be doing 2 years from now, and you may be doing something that's totally different that you have no expertise in. Sounds stupid, right? I mean, from traditional organizational perspective, you're supposed to create expertise to create advantages in the marketplace. But Goldman's view was this: if you're constantly feeling like you're treading water and almost drowning, you're going to constantly develop a habit of reaching out to senior people to ask them if what you're doing is right. Right? And that has very powerful implications for risk mitigation, because as you grow up in the organization, you're basically in a habit of constantly being in touch with people. So the practice is embedded in the structure, which is moving people around in their jobs, and then there are incentives tied to that, right? And so it's a very, very interesting thing to think deeply about the relationship between culture and structure, because I actually think that most organizational problems can be solved in these kinds of ways. Now, I don't want to forget about motivation, because motivation is actually an incredibly important part of what we do from leadership positions, again, but that's not the problems of people at the top of organizations, it's the problems of everybody who's touching people within organizations. How much are you engaged with a process or an active set of thoughts about inspiring somebody to want to get up and come work with you every day? Right? That's kind of the interesting thing about organizational leadership, is that when time is difficult and work is hard and you're asking people to perform more for less, how much are people excited about it? Now, that might just be because you're a fun and inspiring person, but it also might be because your people have the right structural incentives in place that they feel excited and proud and valued. Right? And so there are all kinds of ways to talk about this. Now, this is where the final piece of this framework goes to the part where I actually think some thinking in leadership has been a part of this, but I think it's been thinking in the wrong way. So remember I said that there are a number of personality tests. There's a lot of people who talk about this. There's a whole cottage industry around it. But I actually think the focus on personality is not the point. The focus on honesty and how honest you are with yourself is really the point. I have too often been with leaders, either in advisory positions or in organizations that I was a part of, in which, you know, I can tell you in my former organization, the president was an incredibly charismatic man. The problem was he seemed to have no self-knowledge at all. Right? So he'd give great talks, but there was problems with his team actually feeling committed to him, because he would also go to meetings and say, you know, the interesting thing about me, what makes me a good leader is I'm a great listener. And then he'd talk for 57 minutes out of 60. You ever been around someone like that? How does that actually make you feel as a person? You think, well, not only are you not a good listener and you couldn't care less about what I say, but you don't even seem to realize it, right? And this kind of thing just erodes your credibility as a leader. And so I think deeply knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are and figuring out how to build a team around it is an incredibly important part of leadership. So that introspection piece, I think, is the final piece of that puzzle. So anyway, just to come back to my Steve Jobs missive for a minute, I guess I already kind of gave the punchline of this. But I think it's an incredibly important thing to remember about leadership, because Jobs' problem might have been embedded in his lack of introspection, but it was also deeply embedded in the structure of the organization itself. One of the reasons this company almost failed in 1985 was because the organizational structure itself was problematic. Steve Jobs was the chairman of the board, and he had a CEO that reported to him, and he also reported to that CEO because he couldn't give up his control over products. And so, of course, you're going to have a dysfunctional set of problems in an organization, especially when that particular division is losing money. Right? The main point here that I just like to emphasize, though, is you can usually map these things out. If you're in an organization that you're unhappy in, you can usually figure out what it is that actually that can be traced to, and then take some proactive steps to make it better. Another favorite example of mine is the Google example, which I mentioned earlier. It's so often the case. You'll ask people, what makes Google so innovative? It says, well, first of all, it's in Silicon Valley. They have lots of innovative people. They just hire really smart people. Right? Is that why Google is innovative? Does anybody know what the 80-20 rule is in Google? 80-20 rule is actually a very interesting thing about the structure of the organization itself. Most technology companies have an R&D department in which the innovation happens, right? So basically it's taken out of the hands of the engineers or the technicians and put into the hands of an R&D department, and they spend a significant amount of money on it. Google decided they didn't want to do that because they believe that engineers are themselves innovative and creative people. And why shouldn't they want to actually be a part of all of that that's going on? So if Google it's mandated that you're allowed to spend 80% of your time on core functions of the organization, but you're also mandated to spend 20% of your time on new projects and ideas. We're not going to spend the money on an R&D department, but we're going to bank on you. Now, what does that do? That basically creates this dynamic in which everybody believes their ideas can live, right? So they're not just handed the technical stuff by the people who are in the sexy R&D department. They're actually a part of the future of the organization, and so you have all of these innovative ideas constantly bubbling up. My main point here is that that is embedded in the structure of the organization. A formal set of structural constraints were put in place to say, how do we want to create this? We're not going to get a culture of innovation by saying it should be so. We're going to incentivize people and define their jobs accordingly. So that's one of the things that I love about this. I'll add another piece to this, which I think is another aspect of leadership, or I'll give you two more, and then I'm going to go very quickly into what I think are the forgotten tenets of leadership. I believe in courage in leadership. I believe that leadership has to be about figuring out what the riskiest things to do are, and then figuring out how to move people to push your organization in that direction. Intel in China is my favorite example of this recently. Here is one of the most successful companies in the world going gangbusters from their headquarters in Shanghai, and they decided at some point, you know, Shanghai is kind of boring today, and we need to have a culture of constantly pushing ourselves. So what's the next frontier? We're actually going to pick up stakes and move out to this sleepy town called Chengdu, because we believe that that's really the future, and we're going to make it so. And of course, it was a very risky decision. A lot of people thought it was a huge mistake, but it turned out to be this brilliant prophetic move, because actually the Western development of China has completely catapulted them into another stratosphere. The main thing here is you've got to have courage in order to think about leadership. Now, my forgotten tenets. The field of leadership is, there's a big debate, as I described, where these myths come out. I take a very kind of managerial and structuralist approach to how to think about leadership. But there are a couple things also that I just, in teaching about leadership over the years, have been, to me, incredibly important that are often left out of the conversation. The first of these is complexity. I actually think the field of leadership has been damaged by the extent to which the field of strategy has been too much influenced by economics. In economics, and it's easy to take pot shots at the field of economics right now, and I shouldn't do it, but as a sociologist, I can't help it. This is a field that's very sophisticated in terms of its theoretical mathematical models. Right? But the problem is that being able to get to through those theoretical mathematical models requires simplifications and assumptions of how the world works. The problem is that the world is not a simple place. The world is immensely complex on two levels. It's immensely complex at the environmental level, so the environments that organizations are embedded in are crazy complex today, and they're becoming more and more so. Whether you want to talk about technology and the evolution of technology, or globalization, or understanding cultures of different places, this is an immensely complex world, and you cannot simplify the models. Complexity matters, and embracing complexity is ultimately where you find opportunities for success. The country of China, I think, is the best at this. China actually has a very different model for thinking about economic modeling than we do. We tend to have economic modeling that leads the conversation, and then those economic models are implemented in fiscal policy, right? China's approach is completely the opposite. China's approach is to say, the world is so complex, the economic modeling doesn't mean much. So what we're going to do is a process that they call groping for stones to cross the river. We're going to move very slowly. We're going to see what works in terms of experimentation. And then as that experimentation kicks in, we're going to have a feedback loop where that process is actually going to guide our economic policies. Very, very different in its mindset, and it's not well understood how different it is, but it's incredibly important because it's about embracing complexity. There's a second level of complexity, though, which is the complexity of the human mind, and that psychology should not be underestimated. There's a whole field in management departments that's the more micro side, the OB, and a lot of people come out of psychology. It's not really my field, but I have immense respect for what people in that field do. And I think it's incredibly important for understanding organizations as well. Failure, a big forgotten tenet. I mentioned the Goldman example, but of most of the organizations that I really admire, you will hear talk among senior executives of not only putting people in positions to fail, but actually encouraging them to stretch with the expectation that they might. Now, the important thing here is not the failure. The important thing here is what the organization does to you when you fail. Right? So do you live in an organization that actually encourages you to stretch, but then slaps you down when you don't deliver? Or do you live in an organization that actually encourages you to stretch and then debriefs and processes and rewards you for stretching rather than hurting you for failing? Right? And so that's a very, very, to me, it's a forgotten tenet of all of this. And probably the most important forgotten tenet, this is my favorite, this is, by the way, my favorite leadership book that's been on the market in the last year. It's actually not a leadership book, but it is the most applicable book that I've ever read for leadership. And it's on the phenomenon of being wrong. There are two interesting things that come out of this for me. The first is that Catherine makes this beautiful point that is so basic and so fundamental it seems obvious, but I just never thought of it this way, which is that the difficult thing about being wrong is it feels exactly the same as being right. And you can't get out of that any other way. You have to actually just always be attuned to the fact that you might be wrong, even if you feel sure that you know you're right. Now, how that translates into leadership is that leaders have to be able to admit that they're wrong. You have to be able to say, I'm sorry. Now, there's an interesting thing here in which there's actually the field of leadership is fairly divided on this issue. There's a big debate over the question of whether or not you look too weak in front of your minions if you're constantly admitting you're wrong. But I actually think that it gains so much credibility and trust for you that sometimes you have to make fast decisions with imperfect information. But your ability then to actually come back and say, that was the wrong decision and I'm sorry, that was my fault, I think is just a very, very important and powerful aspect of leadership. Now, to close out, I just want to give you kind of my sort of favorite highlights, and this actually comes from one of my favorite leaders. Whenever I do these exercises of asking people who their favorite leaders are, I always get the question back. So one of them is a guy named Keith Reinhardt. He's the former chairman and CEO of DDB Worldwide, somebody who is a legend in the advertising industry and really transformed that industry. He's somebody I got to know very well over the last couple of years, and he's just one of these amazing people who had so much creativity and so much power when he was at the height of his game, but you would never know it because he's just the humblest and most modest guy I'd ever met. So I one time was interviewing him and asked him to come up with his top highlights for leadership, so here they are. He always said you should hire people who are better than you. Now you got to be a somewhat modest person to even think like that, but it's an incredibly important mindset. Because if you want people who are weak to be reporting to you so that they don't threaten you, you're always going to have a weaker organization. You should also always be passionate about ideas, but it's not just about ideas, it's about creating an environment that nurtures them. And if you're a leader who gets into a position of power and you're an autocratic person who doesn't listen to other people, your organization is going to be less loyal. You should be open to surprises, but expect the unexpected. Along the lines of hiring people who are better than you, you cannot compete with them. You should be always open to the idea that your team probably may or hopefully has a better idea than you. And by the way, even if they don't, the position of the leader should be about taking responsibility and giving credit. In that sense, if you're in a senior position in an organization, the job can kind of suck because your job really is to constantly take responsibility and be on the line for delivering, but give out the credit and give it out widely when your organization delivers. The reason for this, it's counterintuitive, but the reason for this is you will create a much more committed and devoted team if you do that. And I remember early on in my life, I was the mentee of a very, very powerful, charismatic academic. And he was so likable if you watched him giving a talk in front of a room. He could convince anybody of what he wanted them to believe. But the problem was, he was just always taking a little bit too much credit and giving out a little bit too much blame. And people couldn't work with him. It was the downfall of this guy's trajectory of power. So I just think it's a great thing. And the final thing is, dare to be naive. Dare to actually take the risks. Now, Keith's favorite quote of leadership when I asked him about this came from Lao Tzu. And it's sort of as indicative of the personality that I just described to you, an individual who would much rather lead from behind and have everybody on his team believe that they did it themselves rather than him actually taking the credit or telling them what to do. Now, finally, I know I'm over my time, but I want to give you a couple of takeaway points just so you walk away with something here. These are my kind of core ideas that are extracted from this talk. Position. I already mentioned this, but I think it's important. It's not about the position that you're in. It's about how you act in that position. So don't wait. Don't decide you're going to sit on your hands until you get that promotion. Leadership is about your decision of how to act today. It's about everyday action and introspection. Forget about the grand moment. It's not about the crisis, and it's not about when somebody asks you to step up because we need you. It's about what you do on a day-to-day basis. And unfortunately, some of those things don't feel like leadership moments, but believe me, in the aggregate, they are. It's also about how well you know yourself in that everyday decision making. Probably above all else, it's about the extent to which you think about the greater good of the organization. And that's actually the big divide. To me, the big divide is not visionary versus person who executes. The big divide is when you analyze that person's actions. Are they acting in the best interest of the organization? Or are they worried about their own self-interest first and the organization's second? And that's a tough one. I mean, because everybody has lives to lead and they have things that they need to do. But to me, that's really what defines leadership probably above all else. Leadership is about empowerment and creating a culture that fosters creativity. It's about complexity and analysis. And finally, and I think I've learned this more in the last year than I had ever known it before, but it is about empathy. You've got to learn to sit down and listen to people and try to understand where they're coming from. And you got to care. So anyway, I'm sorry if I ran over my time, but I think we probably have about 10 minutes for questions, so I'll just close right there. Thank you.